السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل الرئيس الأميركي جو بايدن يتبنى نهجا عسكريا في منطقة الشرق الأقصى بعد الانسحاب الأمريكي من أفغانستان. ويشير المعينون من عالم مراكز الأبحاث المتشددة ضمن فريقه إلى احتمال تجدد التوترات مع كوريا الشمالية، وكذلك اشتعال الحرب الباردة مع الصين. ولتنسيق نهجه العسكري الجديد في تلك المنطقة، عين بايدن كورت كامبل، وهو دبلوماسي محترف وعضو في جماعة ضغط تجارية منخرط في الموقف التقليدي للحرب الباردة تجاه آسيا، ومنظر بارز مناهض للصين. كان كامبل يستعد لمنصبه منذ سنوات. خلال حقبة أوباما صنع اسمه باعتباره المهندس الرئيسي لمحور آسيا، والذي نقل تركيز القوات العسكرية الأميركية من الشرق الأوسط إلى المحيط الهادئ. لعب كامبل دورا رئيسيا في محاولة إدارة أوباما إيقاف البرامج النووية لكوريا الشمالية بمزيج من الضغط العسكري والهجمات الإلكترونية السرية والعقوبات الاقتصادية المستمرة. وتشير تقارير إلى أن كامبل هو أحد مؤسسي مركز الأمن الأمريكي الجديد CNAS، وهو مركز أبحاث عسكري أعضاؤه متشددون في أفكارهم تجاه المنطقة، وبات أحد الروافد الأساسية لفريق إدارة بايدن. وبحسب المصادر فإن CNAS يموله العديد من كارتيلات السلاح التي تمد القوات الأمريكية بالدعم في كوريا واليابان، بما في ذلك جنرال أتوميكس وبوينغ وجنرال داينامكس ولوكهيد مارتن ونورثروب جرومان وريثيون. تيم شوروك الصحافي الاستقصائي الأميركي الذي نشأ وعاش في اليابان وكوريا الجنوبية، والخبير في العلاقات الأميركية الكورية وفي عالم الاستخبارات الأميركية والسياسة الخارجية، كيف يقرأ محور آسيا اليوم، ولا سيما عقب الهزيمة العسكرية في أفغانستان. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Tim Shorrock, American investigative journalist and labor activist, expert on U.S.-Korean relations, U.S. intelligence and foreign policy, joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the Inside, sir.
Thank you very much.
Pure pleasure to have you. Well, according to President Biden, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are fundamentally different from Afghanistan. As an expert, sir, might you tell us more about what is now transpiring in Afghanistan in the context of U.S. military and strategic ties with South Korea, with Japan, with Taiwan, and its other Asian allies?
Well, first of all, it's important to recall that in the previous Democratic administration of President Obama, where Joe Biden was the vice president, the policy was the Asia pivot, sort of refocusing U.S. Military resources and the whole strategic focus of American policy back to Asia. And by that, they meant East Asia, South Korea, Japan, in particular. Mm-hmm. And so this began, during the Obama administration. It kind of it shifted back to the Middle East under President Trump, and then there was this long series of negotiation between the Trump administration and the Taliban in Afghanistan, which resulted in the U.S. withdrawal that President Biden has overseen the last couple of weeks. But I think when he made those statements recently, lots of people have been asking the U.S. government, well, if you're going to leave Afghanistan, what prevents you from leaving South Korea or Japan? And I think, he was trying to respond to that. And in a way, this return to Asia, this pivot to Asia is continuing. And I think it means that the U.S. really sees its kind of core national security interests in terms of military forces in Asia, keeping them in South Korea and Japan, which are an integrated command with the U.S. military. The U.S. military has a close alliance with South Korea. It also has a close military alliance with Japan, and together these form a very formidable military force and alliance. And I think that's where the focus of American policy is going to be, and where President Biden is trying to keep it on East Asia and get the U.S. military out of Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East and refocus on Asia.
Right. Chung Han-byom, professor of international security studies at Korea National Defense University, notes that the Korean Peninsula and the Asian region consist of the core of American national interest. Korea, as we all know, is second to Japan in the region in terms of the size of U.S. military assets hosted. Japan hosts around 55,000 American troops. Today, when the U.S.-China rivalry is deepening, it's hard to imagine the U.S. government considering pulling out of the region. You believe, sir, that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan enhances the strategic value of U.S. allies in South Korea and in Japan. However, could this end up increasing military tensions in Asia today in the process of so-called deterring China, which is the one foreign policy issue that has full U.S. bipartisan support?
Well, I do think that it's going to increase that strategic value, but I do think that it's going to, tensions are already high in East Asia. Tensions are high with China. The U.S. and China both are involved in kind of naval confrontations where the U.S. sails its warships through the Taiwan Straits between Taiwan and the mainland of China, which they've been doing for decades, but they've been increasing it lately. And so, there's a lot of tension between China and some of the countries in the region, like Vietnam, Philippines, and Japan and Korea, over China's encroachment on certain Asian territories. And so the tensions have been high around that issue. But, lately the U.S. has been really focusing on China as kind of a strategic enemy, as a kind of strategic opponent, both militarily and economically. And I think with this, concentration of forces in South Korea and Japan, and of course, we also have to consider there's also a major U.S. bases in the island of Guam, which is part of the United States, but it's part of the Pacific. That's where our strategic bombers are based, for example, B-52s and B-1B bombers. And so these are all part of this very massive U.S. military structure in East Asia and the Pacific. And, we've been there, the United States has been there for, almost 75 years now. And so there, I think in the long run, yes, it has bipartisan support in the United States, but there's a lot of people here in the United States in the peace movement and organizations that are seeking a sort of more a more progressive foreign policy in the United States, that maybe those tensions should be decreased, and in the long run, that the U.S. should perhaps go back to the détente with China that was so long, from the 1970s until recently. There was, China was seen as a strategic competitor, but we didn't have this tension.
But Mr. Shorrock, do you believe that this could be plausible in light of the moves that the Biden administration have been taking towards Taiwan?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, yes, we have a lot of, there's no U.S. troops in Taiwan, but the United States sells them plenty of, very advanced military equipment and fighter planes and other kinds of weapons systems. So Taiwan is very well armed. The U.S. has been talking with Japan about, a Japanese role if there is a war with China over Taiwan. And Japan itself is being very assertive in this area. Japan tends to follow whatever the U.S. policy is. South Korea plays a little different role, and Japan is very much aligned with the U.S. in terms of confronting China. South Korea is in a different position. South Korea wants to have a relationships with China, in part because part of the peace process in Korea, dealing with North Korea, China must be involved, and that's very critical to South Korea's future. Is what happens with North Korea and what happens with the relationships with China too.
Right.
So it's not a completely united front, and there is some tensions between the U.S. and its allies. But I don't see any chance of the U.S. withdrawing any forces from that area anytime soon. U.S. relationships with those countries is probably going to only deepen.
Right. Allow us, sir, to stop now for a short break, and then afterwards we will come to talk more about COIN, or counterinsurgency, as a form of warfare, but after the break. إذن فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
في المسائية، أرامكو في راس التنورة ومواقع أخرى في جدة، القوات المسلحة اليمنية تقصف مجددا. كيف أصبحت السعودية في موقع المتلقي للضربات والمتنقل بين الأزمات؟ ولماذا فرملت اندفاعاتها نحو التطبيع؟ هل لفشل الرهان على تل أبيب منذ سيف القدس وتقدم محور المقاومة؟ في المسائية، قصف في العمق وقنص من النقطة الصفر. المسائية تأتيكم يومياً 10:00 مساءً بتوقيت القدس الشريف.
أهلا بكم من جديد. Tim Shorrock, American investigative journalist and expert on U.S.-Korean relations. Welcome back, sir. Well,
thank you.
Most welcome. Counterinsurgency, or COIN, is a form of warfare, the new American way of war, as one might call it, where you adopt various economic, political, and social programs, in addition to going after and killing people, of course. How dangerous is this warfare? Is COIN a viable strategy? What is its history beyond the glossy descriptions peddled by its enthusiasts in the military and the liberal power elite and realms?
Well, first of all, as you said, counterinsurgency means killing people. It's still a war, but it's a kind of war where the U.S. or the government it's supporting tries to show that it's the best alternative to whatever the other side is. And so, if it's a counterinsurgency, as it was in Vietnam, it was trying to show the people of Vietnam that the U.S. and the South Vietnam government would be a much better steward of the country than the communists who wanted to run it. The communists who want to run it were running it now, and it's known. It became known to Americans during Vietnam War as known by the term hearts and minds. You win the hearts of minds of the people by providing sort of social services and housing, water, support for agriculture. All kinds of means like that, in addition to fighting the war and identifying the true enemy, the people that want to fight the United States. But it goes way back, actually, in my view. One of the first counterinsurgencies that the U.S. presided over was in southern Korea before the country was formally divided into two states, the United States occupied the southern part of Korea in the late 1940s and carried out a very bloody war against a leftist anti-colonial movement in the South, long before North Korea invaded the South. And so this goes way back, but it's still a very deadly kind of warfare.
Sure.
And it's just been given this kind of humanistic sheen by many American liberals. I heard you talking about this think tank CNAS, the Center for New American Security in Washington, which has been promoting this idea, promoted it very heavily in Afghanistan. And of course, they tried this in Iraq as well.
True.
But it's still a form of warfare. It still involves, bombing people, killing people, and often civilians are caught up in that.
Right. But Timothy, who are the Coindinistas, as they term them, and why is America's deadly embrace of counterinsurgency considered by observers as a wrong turn?
Well, because another word for it could be really colonialism. I mean, when I was doing reporting on this in the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan a couple of years ago, I talked to some American military people who disagreed with it as a policy, and it requires the United States to actually be in that place, be in that country for many years and decades, and it's very much like the British colonialism in the Middle East and other parts of the world, during the 19th century and early 20th century, where you end up, providing, substituting your government for their government. And so you not only making war, but you're providing all these social services, like we said, but it's still a war. And so the proponents are people like, General Petraeus, who was the commander of U.S. forces in the Central Command in the Middle East for a long time. He kind of, led. He was the disciple, the promoter of counterinsurgency tactics in Iraq and Afghanistan. General McMaster, who was President Trump's national security advisor for a while, he was very big on counterinsurgency in Iraq. And I think these people who also deepened the U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan in the name of counterinsurgency, and that war went very badly because the United States ended up, alienating many of the people that it was supposed to be helping, and it was seen largely as a failure. It did not work. We threw millions and millions and millions of dollars. Most of it, and many of the projects are managed by contractors who have profit motive behind what they're doing. And it was a disaster in Afghanistan. It was a disaster in Iraq. It just didn't work. It didn't work to win allegiance of people.
In a similar vein, Mr. Tim, Michael Rubin of AEI, American Enterprise Institute, said about the U.S. forces' withdrawal from Afghanistan that it fixed the reality of NATO as a dead man walking. In an earlier piece reflecting his fury at Biden, Rubin says plainly what Afghanistan was always truly about in the view of Washington's hawks, quote, disrupting Central Asia to weaken Russia and China. So it's not about protecting women's rights and girls' education and spreading democracy.
Well, no, it's not. I mean, and you can see this in country after country where it's been tried. I'm most familiar with it in East Asia, Korea, as I said, and also in Vietnam. I mean, in Vietnam, it consisted of moving the people away from the guerrilla forces out of the countryside, putting them in essentially what became known as, they were basically concentration camps where they herded villagers into these camps to take them away from the people. And then, people in Vietnam did not like it. The counterinsurgency in Vietnam was also accompanied by the assassination of many Vietnamese cadre who were fighting the United States. 20,000 cadre were murdered by the CIA in that counterinsurgency. And so, it's a vicious cycle. And people like Rubin, they want to have the U.S. have a permanent military war state. They want this war to continue. They believe the U.S. has a strong, need to remain in Afghanistan, not only to fight terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-K, this new group that conducted the bombing yesterday, but they see it as strategic need of the United States, and it just could not be explained to American people year after year why Americans were dying there, and then that it just didn't seem to be any purpose to it, and it's very unfortunate.
Sure. Drawing on interviews with key players in the intelligence industrial complex, contractors' annual reports and public filings with the government, and on-the-spot reporting from intelligence industry conferences and investor briefings, your book, Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Intelligence Outsourcing, provides the first behind-the-scenes look at this new way of spying. Your book goes behind today's headlines to highlight how private corporations are aiding the growth of a new and frightening national surveillance state. Tell us more, Tim.
Well, since the late 1990s, many intelligence operations of the United States have been contracted out to private companies. This began sort of after the Cold War, and there was a big reduction in intelligence forces and intelligence budgets. And then when the United States had a military need or a strategic need in some country like Korea or Iraq, and the U.S. forces were smaller, the U.S. government forces were smaller, and they needed extra people, they turned to contractors. And then, this began in the late 1990s, but after 9/11 attacks, and after the U.S. began launching, attacks on Afghanistan shortly after 9/11, then the intelligence budgets increased by a huge amount in this so-called war on terror, and with the money that was pouring into the intelligence community, intelligence agencies, they began hiring contractors at a very rapid pace. And so you have companies, some of which you named earlier in the program. A company like DynCorp, for example, was the largest single contractor in Afghanistan. And they carry out many of the same, kinds of operations that the military does. And particularly in the counterinsurgency, they're very involved in providing these kind of social services that are part of the counterinsurgency. The information has been leaked by contractors.
Sure.
So they're very pervasive, and I think there's very little oversight and very little control over what they do. And I think what I wrote about in that book partly was that there's also, because there's little oversight of them, that the U.S. can often take part in black operations and in covert operations using contractors, and there can be the contractors can be used in many secret ways that the American public does not know.
Thank you for addressing that in your book, Tim. Tim Shorrock, American writer and expert on U.S. foreign policy and U.S. national security and intelligence and East Asian politics. Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your expert opinion.
Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, always a pleasure. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.